Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Joe here from Me's Macau Stan,
Hello and greetings.
and today we're starting a new podcast series, one about Chinese history. Now, we've occasionally discussed other countries' histories, and we're still doing a podcast on French and English history, which we'll be recording for tomorrow and the day after. But for now, let's start with China. China is a country which has had um, a lot of attention in recent years. Almost all of it negative by Americans because there's a weird hatred that's been there since, well, the early Obama years, thereabouts, as China began to overtake America in terms of technological advancement and economic stability. And the Chinese economy continues to rise. And even as our own in the West continues to stagnate. Quite when China's economy will stop growing is not clear. And recent economic studies show that as the population declines, it may grow even more because they won't be as strapped by the pension plan and social security stuff of the older generation, which I'm not basing that off of my own theories. I'm basing that off of the head of BlackRock's statements about China. But long before we had the American-Chinese economic cultural war, long before any of us were even born, or a gleam in our father's eyes, we had, at the dawn of time, only tribal civilizations. And the thing is, when I say dawn of time, I mean recorded time. And the thing is, where other civilizations had begun around the year between 5,000 and 3,000, such as Egypt with the Scorpion King, or Scorpion Kings, I should say, as there were a great many kings who took up the title of Scorpion King. Now, in the ancient period, you had very few civilizations east, at first, of the Middle East, because a lot of civilization and city-states began in Egypt and over in, along the Euphrates and whatnot. Now, you did have some villages, towns, and civilizations here and there elsewhere, but we don't know much about it. And speaking of mysteries lost to the mist of time, quite how or when China was exactly founded is still unclear. Now, around the year 2200 to 2000 BC, we have what, sometime at that point, a group of villages that clump together, and we start to get, we do get an actual royal lineage, that of the Shin. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. The Shin were a dynasty that were said to have been descended from the Jade Emperor. And we don't know anything. It's just archaeological pottery fragments and other stuff. It's so darn unclear, we can't actually make a statement about it. And so, it's only good for really a prologue episode to a podcast. It's not good for much else. And we're just going to pass over it because while there's mythological stories, and some of them are pretty interesting, and I do recommend people try reading them, I don't know anything about them and about this era. And no one really does. So, glossing over it, to the Shang. Now, the Shang are interesting to an extent in that we know very little as well, but we start to get some mythological stories. Now, the founding myth of the Shang is that a woman by the name of Jiandi, who was the second wife of Emperor Ku, swallowed an egg dropped by a black bird and gave birth miraculously to Xie. Xie, I think it is said to have helped Yu the Great to control the Great Flood. And he was given Shang as a fief. But, we don't really know much more than this. We don't really have a founding period exactly, but we have roughly around the year 1600 BC as the possible date when this kingdom is formed. And Taiyi was said to be the founder. And of course we have as the main source the Annals of the Yin by Shuma Xian. I hope I'm pronouncing these names right. I'm probably butchering them. But Xie would be followed by 13 generations. And his descendant, Tong, was to overthrow the impious and cruel final Xia ruler in the Battle of Mingtiao. And after this, we get several more descendants. Taijie, Tai Wu, Pang Gong, Wu Ding, Wu Yi, Di Xin. And Di Xin was said to be the last Shang king. And if I'm glossing over the Shang, it's because, once again, we mostly have mythological stories. Even Shuma Qian, a lot of his knowledge is very... how do I put it? We can't say for certain that that's exactly what happened. Now, there's evidence pointing to a lot of what he... I shouldn't say writes about, but I can't even say guess at. It's just so unclear. Now, we know the Shang existed. We know because we have the oracle bones. And historians obsess about the oracle bones, what they mean, what they say, and whatnot. And the sad thing is, I will criticize and condemn them a little. Too many historians and archaeologists focus too much on the archaeological dig here, in that what they found there, and too much on the oracle bones, and not enough on the events. What do the stories mean? What exactly happened? They don't care about that. It's only the oracle bones. They think they can glean the mystery from oracle bones they've already deciphered. But we know what they say, and it's mostly day-to-day curses or predictions and whatnot, and records and the like. But none of it really relates to the political history for the most part, I think. So we're left really just relying on Shuma Qian, though archaeologists and historians are still obsessing about oracle bones, which tell us absolutely nothing. So it's, in my opinion, kind of like if we focused on sword fragments from early Francia, that is to say around the 5th to 6th century of France. What if we just focused on sword fragments rather than, when did Clovis actually form the kingdom? When did he conquer who? No, we're just going to focus on the sword fragments. What the sword fragments tell us is that the sword was half rusted by the 8th century. It's as if we would be doing that. Really, criticism, there's not enough criticism and hate mail leveled at these incompetent buffoons. Now, historians of the Han through to the Qing period should be praised. Those who study the Shang and Zhou period out to be flogged for the streets and chucked into the Yangtze River. And if you're nowhere near there, you could chuck them in the Pacific. Or the Atlantic. No picking them out of the ocean. They don't deserve saving. And part of me is entirely serious because I've had to spend 3 weeks trying to crack through these historic sources, and all I get are records on oracle bones. I'm tired of reading 500 pages of oracle bone data, which just tells me, I don't know. Yeah, I'm ranting here. I don't know what happened. Well, why don't you say that and then move on? No, we need 500 pages of the Cambridge history of ancient Chinese history to tell us we don't freaking know anything on the Shang.
I mean, we could probably argue that we know more about the First Nations because at least the Jesuits recorded stuff.
Yeah, the Shang didn't really record much. Thankfully, there's a longer literary tradition where the Zhou are concerned. The Zhou recorded a great deal, or at least the later Han did, about them, and even the Jin. So we have this lengthy literary tradition and historic tradition about the Zhou, which, thank heavens. Otherwise, this would just be me screaming and ranting and raving about incompetent archaeologists and historians. Now, the thing is, the Zhou ended up eventually conquering the Shang. As to where they came from, they apparently came from further east, closer to Shang, and moved west. Or northwest, I should say. And they established themselves, at least during their pre-dynastic period, in the area of Zhou Yuan, I think it is. And we are relying again on inscriptions on bones and shells, but this time they're a little more reliable. And apparently the pre-dynastic house that ruled over Zhou worshipped the Shang ancestors. And given one of the kings, King Wen, had a mother who was a Shang princess and his wife was one also, it shows that these were two closely related dynasties. But eventually, now I'm glossing over a bit because, once again, we don't know a damn thing. We have, from the year 2200 BC up through to around 1059 BC, we know squat. So it's all mythological stories and folklore, which are great stories, and I plan to read them later and do a separate podcast about them. But for the purposes of this podcast, how do I put it? It's not really relevant because we're looking purely at the history, and we are kind of trying to hurry it up to Qin and Han because that's the interesting period. That and the autumn and spring period. Or spring and autumn period. I forget however it goes. But the early Warring States period through to the Qin and the Han is a very fascinating era. So we're kind of going to hurry it up as quickly as we can to that period and then just carry on. Now, it's in the 5th month, so May, of 1059 BC that we get an interesting solar event wherein 5 major planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, Venus, and Mercury, are gathered in a narrow area. And they apparently can be seen in the northern sky, visible from the Zhou capital at the foothills of the Qi Mountains. So apparently this was a major planetary event. And it happened in the 32nd year of the late Shang King's reign, according to what written records that we have of the period that are reliable. And it's transmitted, of course, primarily through literary tradition. Because literary tradition's what we're relying on primarily, with the odd oracle bone. Now, I know I bashed the oracle bones, but some of them are reliable. Most of them are not. I should know I've read more than 500 pages of oracle bone analysis, which boil down to we don't know. These things are frighteningly vague. So, a lot of historians will obsess about it. I don't know why, but a lot of historians are also prone to a drinking culture. That I do know. And I think it's affecting their brains, the few they have. And if I'm bitter and angry, it's because I've wasted 3 weeks reading through 500 pages of literally nothing. Oh, wait, I just checked. No, it's 690 pages of oracle bones. So I wasted 3 weeks reading 700 pages of oracle bone bullcrap. So, yeah, I'm allowed to be a little touchy and to be a little prissy about oracle bones. And the thing is, I want to primarily use Cambridge history and early China social and cultural history, but they're so obsessed with the oracle bones. And early China social and cultural history has, as its main writer, a Chinese historian who speaks really bad Chinese English. His English translation has some sentences which are just garbled, and I can't understand. So that's where, yeah, like, not everyone writes thorough records like Generals of the South, which is the best historical secondary source for the Romance of the Three Kingdoms era, covering the periods of Sun Jian, Sun Ce, and Sun Quan. But anyways, we have to suffer with what we've got until we get to the Qin period. So, the thing is, King Wen, at some point in his reign, likely almost a decade in, is said to receive the Mandate of Heaven. Now, the Mandate of Heaven was the idea of the benediction from up above that you have the right to rule. Now, it's also a grassroots idea. So when a ruler is tyrannical and bad, and his dynasty has become decadent, they lose the mandate. They no longer have the right to rule. And so the legitimacy that to rule over China or Korea or Japan goes from that ruler and his dynasty to another. It's transferred to the worthy. Now, technically, the divine right of kings also has this idea in the West, but there's a lot of dumb people who have forgotten this idea, this aspect of the divine right of kings. Really, divine right of kings and mandate of heaven are pretty much interchangeable. The idea either way was God or the heavens will favor a certain ruler and his dynasty, and they have an obligation to rule well and to cater to their nation and people. Now, in the modern age, this has fallen by the wayside and is mocked, even as we see those societies that do mock this sort of thing falling apart. So, from a purely observational standpoint, there's good reason to perhaps think it's kind of legitimate, even today. And I'm actually thinking of kind of places like U.S., Canada, Britain, and even Germany and whatnot. The mandate of heaven and divine right seems to have fallen from a lot of our leaders. So, that said, King Wen ended up breaking away from the Shang dynasty, and he begins to eliminate many of the pro-Shang communities located in the Wei River Valley, near where he had regional hegemony, and he establishes his hegemony over the western periphery of Shang. So he's slowly taking over a good chunk of territory to solidify himself and better construct a position with which to attack east, to attack the Shang dynasty. And it's possible that he attacked some of the towns and areas to the south of Shang. in order to engulf it. Now, once he had enough power, he would found a new capital, it said, Fong, which was built on the west bank of the Fong River, near the Wei River Plain. And this was done shortly before King Wen passed away in 1049 BC. Now, at the time of his death, there must have been a great deal of desire to attack further east, but things didn't go over very well in that, well, you lose your king and you can't really advance. That kind of puts a delay on invasions. So, apparently, though, his heir was King Wu, the martial king, and after 3 years of mourning, King Wu sets out on a campaign to the east and arrives with Zhou troops at what's called in this book Muye, and it's on the outskirts of the Shang capital of Anyang. Actually, just real quick, I like the sound of Anyang. But we then have the Zhou, who are joined by a great many tribes and communities, armies, in, well, for the battle that's to come. And what we get is, in one record, King Wu campaigned against Shang. It was the morning of the Jiazi day. Jupiter was upright, and we defeated them at the dusk of the day. By the dawn, we had occupied Shang. On the Xinwei day, the king was at the Jian garrison, and he rewarded official Li with metal. Li herewith makes for Duke Zhan this treasured sacrificial vessel. Now, this is apparently a battle which is used as the inauguration of the founding of Western Zhou as a dynasty. And what happens next is that King Wu occupies a great chunk of Shang and stations two of his brothers near the Shang capital. And the conquered Shang people are placed under Wugong, the son of the last Shang king, as a kind of nominal vassal ruler. So Zhou, which had begun as kind of vassals to Shang, now reverse the relationship and make Shang the vassal, the tributary. And this can't have been anything but humiliating for Wugong. And, of course, the Zhou return west with their king, and King Wu, of course, unceremoniously suffers from a bad case of dead by 1043. And this is only 2 years after the conquest. Now, the Duke of Zhou becomes the de facto leader at court. And two of his older brothers are to join Wugong and his former Shang subjects, and they all rebel. And this rebellion ends up lasting for 3 years. And the Duke of Zhou and the Duke of Shao, and of course their king, ends up, who is called Chong, I think it is, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, are basically to split up and not search for clues, but annihilate the Shang. Which, on the one hand, you can kind of understand Wugong for wanting to rebel, because he's been utterly publicly humiliated and his father killed. On the other hand, the two elder brothers of the Duke of Zhou rebelling is kind of impious on their part. Now, yes, they were passed over probably for the regency and for the highest position at court. But to turn on your own family and seek to destroy it, And the sad thing is, this is not going to be the last time this happens in Chinese history. This crops up over and over again, and not just in Chinese history, but history around the world. So this is something that will repeat and is ultimately very tragic. But the Duke of Zhou, while he's the most prestigious military commander and a popular literary figure in Chinese history, is outlived by his brother, the Duke of Shao, who apparently ended up conquering and pacifying 5 local rulers in the east who were loyal to the Shang dynasty. So that's during the war. So that in of itself shows the Duke of Shao was very competent, and that we shouldn't just ascribe all the great deeds to one great man, the Duke of Zhou, but to a trio, the King Shang, Duke of Zhou, and Duke of Shao. But before Shang, we have to remember King Wu had begun the process of conquest, and King Wu had the help of Duke of Zhou and Duke of Shao. So what we have at the start is King Wen beginning the process of taking the periphery. He's preparing the way, he's paving the way for a slow but steady rise to power for the Zhou dynasty. He founds a new capital, he begins building more ties with certain tribes and communities, he establishes a stronger military, and takes periphery areas. In a lot of ways, this is similar to what Hannibal Barca did in Spain when preparing for the war with Rome. You know, you take the periphery regions, you take the buffer regions, and you slowly build capitals and city and resources and wealth. And you slowly work your way to the border. Now, the King of Wu launches the war. And it's a grand war of conquest. But once he takes it, he can't just execute the enemy ruler. That would be unchivalrous and unkingly. So he has to tolerate him. But he has to abase him and lower him. The trouble is that this humiliated ruler has no other choice but to rebel and try to take back power. But once this is done, this gives Zhou an excuse to get rid of him, because now he's shown himself to be an impious vassal. So you have here a slow but steady conquest. It didn't just happen in a day. The formation of Zhou, which is the nation that plants the seeds for what later becomes China, and they don't get enough credit for it because it's the Bronze Age dynasty, and Bronze Age dynasties do matter, is integral, and it shows that China was not built in a day. It was built slowly and gradually. But we must never forget these are not emperors but kings. China does not yet have an emperor. And I stress that part because there are some who think of this as an imperial dynasty. It is not. It is merely a kingly one. A high king of sorts. So, yeah, you've got a gradual ascent for the Zhou dynasty. And the Zhou reigned for quite a long time. Technically, about half a millennia. But they also end up seeing all their subjects break up and start fighting and feuding with each other in a warring state styled way, which is wonderful, really. You just love it when that happens when you're a king, because it completely renders your position moot. That being said, where the French kings would see this happen but would retake power over the course of the warring states period of France, that is to say from the probably 843 thereabouts, 843 to about 12 15 thereabouts, we Faust ends up seeing the kings lose power, regain power, and become very energetic because they have to. They have to be, otherwise they'll be overshadowed and overtaken. But in China, there are a few dynasties that ever lose power and manage to start to retake it. Only really the Tang pull it off until right before, and then they just collapse eventually. And of course, but this isn't to say that you can't really make a comparison, I guess, between these two. But that being said, the Zhou are a interesting dynasty that are mostly lost to history. Now, the Zhou have a slightly different way of running things, and it's interesting just a contrast between the two dynasties. The Shang focused everything around Anyang, focusing everything in a centralized way, even though they lacked a lot of the ability to manage the more periphery regions or even do anything in those regions, showing the flaws of centralized power, really. But the Zhou had a multitude of royal centers. That is to say, royal castles and royal forts and royal cities. And they locate them along the Wei River Plain. And, of course, they do have their capital cities. But they have their two capitals primarily. And, yeah, so this is something of a difference between the two. And this ultimately leads to, well, this is the precursor to the Zhou losing their power, because it's a little more unfocused. So a bit of a middle ground between the two is kind of best, and that's kind of what China's going to do later. Because you got to give the Chinese credit, they do learn from a lot of their mistakes. And in this way, the Han would later prove similar to the Romans in this regard, although the difference is the Romans had a much more robust military, even though they had much less men to man the military. But ultimately, the Han Chinese had, at the time, a, how do I put it? Life just sounds nicer during the Han period, to an extent. I'm just saying, for long periods of that history, it sounds more pleasant than the, well, let's be honest, you don't want to be in Rome during the Civil Wars. But you don't want to be in Rome from Caligula's reign all the way up to, I don't know, Domitian. So, you know, because it's chaotic and, the emperor might just suddenly strike someone dead, just, I don't know, because you have a group of madmen ruling, except for Vespasian and Titus. Well, no, wait, Titus had his lover who was kind of cuckoo. So, okay, you have Vespasian. That's really it in that period. So, but you have Augustus, who has a shining reign. But the Chinese have, even when they're getting decadent rulers who aren't really going out in the streets and slaughtering people, or telling their senators, tear that guy apart, because, I don't know, I feel like it. So, when you make the comparison, like, the Zhou, you can't compare it really to a Western country or society in any way. I know people try, but which one are you going to compare it to? You can't compare it. It's one of those things where it is just late Bronze Age. The Qin introduced iron into the mix. But the civil wars of the Warring States period is more akin to, arguably, the many Neo-Hittite and how do I put it? Peloponnesian Wars. It's more akin to that era. While, to an extent, although Europe had iron by then, but I believe. But on the other hand, you've got by the Alexandrian period, that's roughly synonymous with the Qin Shi Huangdi period. And, of course, you then have the Diadochi War of China between Xu Liang and Liu Bang. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. We still have centuries before we'll get to that. And that part of history is very fascinating. And not enough is written about the collapse of Qin and the rise of Han. So, right now, we're at the beginning. Shang has been overtaken, destroyed, and Zhou reigns supreme. Yay. So, don't forget to smash that like, that subscribe button, and stay tuned for the next episode.